Video lesson 2.3, Imperialism in Africa. So this video lesson is going to go a little bit more in depth into the case studies that we studied today in class and provide you just some additional information on each country so that you can develop those conclusions about what imperialism was like in Africa and how it changed the continent. So once again, this was the results of the Berlin Conference. So we see France is mostly in West Africa. Britain has kind of this Northeast Africa and South Africa. It's kind of this whole portion, everything that's that orange color, in addition to Nigeria and the Gold Coast, which we now know is known as Ghana. And Germany has kind of three little holdings, and we know that Belgium gained the Belgian Congo. And they kind of already had this area here. And then the purple countries, or these bluish purple countries, are Portugal, and the purple countries are Italy. So the first thing we're going to look at today is the Gold Coast. Once again, that is now known as Ghana. Then we'll look at British East Africa, known today as Kenya. Then we'll look at the Belgian Congo, which today is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And then finally, we'll look at France and Algeria and kind of take a case study into French West Africa. All right, so starting with British rule in Ghana. It was known as the Gold Coast and was a colony from 1850 until 1957. And the British ruled by what is known as indirect rule. So if you rule someone directly, then those imperialized people no longer have any power in their government and no more representatives. However, if you rule indirectly, this means that traditional leaders remain in power, but they were held accountable to local colonial representatives and or governors. In the Gold Coast case, it is to governors. So the people in Ghana chose their leaders, and that leader remained in power, but there was a governor of the Gold Coast who made sure that that leader was doing everything that he really wanted to do. So even though it was indirect, it was still being ruled by somebody else. And they still had to integrate European political and cultural values into their government and into their society. It also limited the power of traditional leaders, obviously, because he no longer had sovereignty and was no longer in charge. There was somebody above him, which was that colonial representative. In these traditional leaders, they called stools, and the supreme traditional leader they called the golden stool. And think about stool in this case as similar to a throne, right? So this is our golden stool here. So the main exports of the Gold Coast were obviously gold, palm oil, and ivory, which comes from the tusk of elephants. So many Africans in the Gold Coast actually worked for themselves, which is what makes Ghana, or the Gold Coast colony, unique compared to other African colonies. What does not make it unique is this expansive railroad, which is the map that I have here at right. And these railroads and roads were built by the British, which made trade much more efficient and developed the infrastructure of the Gold Coast. The Asante was the African state which controlled the land and the trade to the north of the Gold Coast for centuries. And this was the main source of resistance which prevented British expansion in the region. So that's kind of where we got this border that is kind of off the map here from Ghana, because these people kept the British out of the interior of Africa, but the kind of economic control that the British had over the region was too firm by the time of 1850, when they actually took over the area as a formal colony. So the Asante continued to offer resistance to the British throughout the time that Ghana was the Gold Coast colony of Britain. And one of the things we're going to do today, we're going to get into a little bit of this resistance piece, but we're not quite going to delve into the independence movements in Africa until later on in the school year, because there are some things that happen in between that are important to know. So to kind of compare and contrast two British colonies, we're going to talk about British rule in Kenya. So Kenya was under British control since 1852, around the same time as Ghana, but only officially a colony from 1920 until 1963. Our next unit is about World War I, which starts in 1914. So you can see, like, already imperialism is still going on throughout the 20th century, and that's why we're holding off talking about those independence movements. So at first the British just wanted Uganda, and they needed to build a railroad through Kenya just to connect Uganda to the Indian Ocean for trade. So this green one here is Uganda, this yellow one is Kenya, and so they just wanted to connect this to this, and so they needed to take over the territory in between those two things to be able to do that. However, that's why Kenya was not an official colony until 1920. But Kenyans, or the Kenyan people, various groups that were living in what is now Kenya, met the British with violent resistance. So the British had to lead a series of military campaigns and maintain military control in many parts of the colony until 1920. So for about 70 years, this was a military-controlled state because these people were fighting back so strongly and for so long that the British had to continue to fight back as well. So this colony did not come as easily as some of the other colonies. And for that reason, it was much more violent than the experience in the Gold Coast. And the colonial economy of Kenya was based on cash crops such as tea and coffee. So it wasn't as precious as the ivory and the gold and jewels of some parts of Africa. So they were really just trying to control the land so that they could reap the benefits of Uganda for their trade. So it was also governed by indirect rule, and a large number of British settled in Kenya. So this is why Kenya is now known today as a settler colony. And because it was known as a settler colony, laws gave settlers special privileges to keep settlers economically superior. And these are settlers from Europe. So people moved from Europe to Kenya, and then because of the way these laws were structured, there was strict segregated housing, public bathrooms, hotels, restaurants, etc. So remember, this is the same time as the American South is going through Jim Crow laws and their racial segregation. This was happening in many colonies in Africa that paralleled what was happening in the American South as well. So those were not unique situations. And a similar situation that you may be more familiar with is the segregation that occurred in South Africa all the way up until 1994, when Nelson Mandela ended that segregation, which is now known as apartheid. So, if you've heard of that, this was a very similar situation. And this ultimately created a society where political and economic privileges were based on race. So these colonial policies gave Africans little choice except to work for the Europeans, usually as laborers on plantations. And the other thing that occurred was that the British government relocated many Africans to these reserves, similar to what the American government did to Native Americans, in order to open up land for more European settlement. So these reserves weren't just a private piece of land. They often lacked water supplies, were way too small for the population. So these are just some pictures of the reserves, and up here is kind of a map of where these reserves are held. So you can see these reserves were where the native Africans were placed, and the rest of the land was used for those cash crops which the Europeans exploited. Here we get to our most violent case study. So this is about the Belgian rule in the DRC, or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, known then as just the Congo. So if you remember this political cartoon down here, Congo is very famous for its rubber. So this political cartoon was representing King Leopold, native Congolese man, and the rubber coils, which were basically that instead of chains, rubber was really what was enslaving the Africans here. So it was a colony from 1885, which, as you remember, is the year of the Berlin Conference, to 1960. It had been a key location in the Atlantic slave trade, which had weakened the society, so it was difficult for this large tract of land to resist imperialism at first. King Leopold II was the Belgian representative in the Berlin Conference, and he took power over the Congo in 1885 when his claims to the land were recognized at the Berlin Conference. And his top priority was to make money off the profitable rubber and ivory exports. Again, ivory coming from elephants. The Congo is a very rainforest-heavy area. And so there were rubber trees need to grow in that kind of jungle environment. So very, very high wealth in rubber and ivory in the Congo. So King Leopold II claimed he was there on a humanitarian crusade. Again, this echoes that notion of the white man's burden. However, he was really just there to exploit the wealth of rubber and ivory in the colony and the economy itself to actually reap those benefits was based on the forced labor of Africans. So the colonial officials came in and essentially forced Africans to work for them for very, very little pay. And the colonial and company officials inflicted extremely brutal abuse on those who did not meet the quotas for the rubber production. Things like rape, mutilation. Up here you can see these men are actually holding severed hands cut off from other people who did not meet their quotas, standing here with, it says British missionaries, so they were there to kind of convert them into Christianity. And so rape, mutilation, and murder were all commonplace. About 10 million Congolese died in the first 20 years of Belgian colonialism. So this really could be defined as a genocide by modern standards. And wealth from the rubber trade, shocker, did not go to the Congo. It went to developing public works in Belgium. So they really did just kind of pillage the Congolese people for their resources and abuse them while they were there. There are about 250 different ethnic groups in the Congo, and it is more than 75 times the size of Belgium itself. So here's kind of an overlay of the outline of the Congo. This little tiny one is Belgium. So you can see how much this land, it's almost bigger than the entire continent of Europe, that little tiny Belgium was able to come in, and because these people were very diverse, they were not organized in one unified society, and they had already been weakened by Europeans using their people in their country for the Atlantic slave trade. They just drew up these borders at the Berlin Conference, which cut through existing African states. The laws in the colony prevented Africans from traveling freely across the borders and from practicing non-European religions. So European religions, mostly Christianity. That's why we saw missionaries in the other picture. It was also a racially segregated society, just like many colonies in Africa, and about 8% of the population was Europeans, and they controlled 42% of the wealth. So about half of the money that was produced in this colony went to only 8% of the population. So the other 92% had to share the other half of the wealth. So you can see kind of the drastic divergence between Europeans and Africans in terms of social class, wealth, economic status, social status, those kinds of things. In the Gold Coast, there were a high number of African professionals. Remember, we said that the Africans often worked for themselves or worked for other Africans. However, in the DRC, there were no African professionals. Africans had to be laborers, and so there were no African doctors, lawyers, educators, etc. So this kept the entire colony very oppressed in comparison to many other colonies. But, and you're thinking, why didn't these people fight back against this terrible, awful King Leopold II? So there is some armed resistance that was organized to resist King Leopold II's rule. The resistance included leaving their jobs in mass. They avoided tax collectors. They generally escaped the colonial powers and control whenever they could by running into other remote or rural regions of the colony or into other colonies. But this was such an oppressive environment that I can very much see why somebody would not be, it would take a lot of courage to do these kinds of armed resistance in this colony in particular. Our last colony we're going to talk about today is Algeria. So this is the largest country in Africa, and it was a colony of France for from 1830 to 1962. So it belonged to France for 130 years. And France invaded Algeria for trade and also to spread their religion and culture, and they were retaliating against tensions with Algeria's ruler. So Algeria was previously occupied by the Ottoman Empire, and I just want to talk about the Ottoman Empire for a second so we have some context going into our next unit. Here's Turkey. This is where the Ottoman Empire was founded and grew from. But at one time, the Ottoman Empire controlled a lot of the Middle East. You can see controlled the trade on the Red Sea on both the African and Asian side here, controlled Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and most of Eastern Europe. So the Ottoman Empire had kind of its hands in a lot of different cookie jars. So they were a huge, massive empire, and we're going to talk about how they kind of declined and fell in the midst of World War I. But they started this because France then took over part of Algeria. So the Algerian militants still fought against French for decades, even though they were glad to be rid of the Ottoman Empire. That didn't mean that they wanted somebody else to rule them. They still wanted to rule themselves. So Algeria also became a French settler colony, so many Europeans settled in Algeria to improve their social political status. So whereas in Paris, they may not have been able to afford such a large fancy house or have as much political clout or power, in Algeria they could move down there and be a colonial powerful representative there. And French laws, this is where we get into that assimilation piece, defined Algerians as subjects. So they did not define them as citizens unless they agreed to stop following Islamic laws. These Islamic laws covered things such as marriage, divorce, other sorts of cultural, societal beliefs that really governed how they lived their life. And if they stopped following those laws, then they would be giving up basically their identity. So many people ended up not actually being defined as citizens. Only about 1%, if that, agreed to stop following these laws and become citizens of France. However, these subjects were subject to harsh punishments for speaking ill of the French government or being rude to a colonial official. They were also massively segregated. So Algerians were not ethnically what we typically think of as ethnically African. They spoke Arabic and they were Muslim. So these Algerians were kept out of certain neighborhoods, beaches, and businesses because they were not French citizens. However, they were French subjects, so they were still, all the laws of France still applied to them and even applied more harshly. So the French believed that their civilization was superior to the Algerians' Muslim culture, which they viewed as primitive or medieval. And they really did push at every opportunity Algerians to assimilate or to change their cultural practices. So they would force them to speak French, to follow French customs, etc. This map over here shows the kind of bright blue. This is all the French-speaking countries, and you'll notice it overlaps very closely with the map that we looked at the beginning of this video. You'll also notice that the Congo is blue. One of the primary languages in Belgium is French, so that is why that is blue as well. And so because many Algerians did not give up these Islamic laws or their Islamic culture, Islam actually played a key role in organizing resistance to French rule. And there was a very brutal war that occurred in the 1960s, and eventually Algeria was successful and gained their independence. So that's the end of our video. Remember to take the quiz on Canvas when you're done.